Well, it looks like it's time to start, so I might as well. Maybe some other people will meander in over the next few minutes. But I'm glad to see you here, and many of you I recognize from yesterday, and good morning. And I definitely appreciate those who've come back for a second helping. Now, our topic this morning is ministering to addicts and those who love them. Well, that is not an easy thing to do. I won't pretend that it is, but I think it's an important thing. Now, as for myself, I've been involved in addiction recovery for a number of years now. Speaking on my own behalf, I've been involved in addiction recovery for 38 years. And I'm very pleased to be able to say that I've been sober for 38 years. And then also, as you can see to my right, I wrote a book on addiction recovery. And I did it because I was very interested in the subject, wanted to learn more about it. And also, as I was writing it, my modus operandi really was, I want to include everything in here that I wish someone had told me when I was actively drinking. So, besides the book, I'm still involved in addiction recovery. I teach out at the local Montford unit. One of their courses is on addiction recovery, and so I always enjoy going through that. In fact, I just finished it not too long ago. And I do pastoral counseling and study the Bible with people struggling with addiction and also those who are in recovery. I've been going out to Montford. I guess it's been about 8 years now. And I teach out there every week, and I preach every other week, and enjoy it very much. But I also facilitate an addiction recovery group at the Plainview Parole Office. I was really shocked when they asked me to come up there, and I'm not sure how they found out about me, but I jumped at the chance, and I often ask the people who come to my class, what is your strategy for staying sober and free? Do you have a plan of recovery? And my usual response that I get is, well, yeah, don't drink, don't drug, and don't commit a crime. Well, I can't disagree with that. I guess we can all go home now. We've got this down pat. But of course, staying sober and free can be a little more complicated if you're a recovering addict. And so I have, over the years of dealing with people on parole, developed a few practical suggestions that I think can be of benefit to anyone who finds themselves ministering to someone in addiction or someone who is close to them. Now, yesterday we mentioned that there's both chemical dependency and behavioral addictions, and I think these suggestions will work in both cases, although this morning I'm probably going to be focusing more on chemical dependency. But I do have an important caveat that I have to mention, and that is, never forget this. You can't help those who don't want to be helped. Just like evangelism can be frustrating, dealing with those in addiction can sure be frustrating. And just don't get down on yourself if you feel like you're not very effective, because unless the addict, him or herself, wants to get sober and free, there is nothing that you can say or do that is going to make that happen. We talked about that yesterday. It's got to be their idea because it's not easy. And just like God is not going to drag anyone kicking and screaming into the kingdom, so you can't drag anyone kicking or screaming into recovery. They've got to want it. And they've got to want it pretty bad. Now, your average recovering addict, their focus is probably mostly on getting sober, staying sober, and staying free, especially if they've had any history of problems with the law. But our job goes beyond that. Our job is to help them see that true freedom is only found in Christ. Amen? Amen. You know, we want to do more than help them learn how to cope with life without their addiction of choice. And we want to save souls. That's the bottom line. As a friend of mine likes to say, the soul is the goal. And we don't want people to attend the church of their choice. Now that may sound intolerant, but I'm sorry. What we want is for people to obey the gospel and be added to the Lord's church. Amen. All right, well, having said all that, let's talk about what I call the keys to staying sober and free. Now, the first one is perhaps the most difficult one. Not to remember, but to do it. It's you've got to change your playground, your playmates, and your playthings. See the alliteration there? It makes it easier to remember. But it's not easy to change all that because you're asking someone to change their entire life. But it's absolutely necessary. You got to convince someone they need to change where they hang out, who they hang out with, and what they do when they're hanging out. Now, for those who have been in prison, changing their playmate sometimes isn't that difficult because all the running buddies totally ignored them the whole time they were locked up. Never got a card or a letter, never got a visit, phone call. They sure didn't get any money on their commissary account. So when those people come by, when they've been paroled and say, hey, you want to get high? You know, they oftentimes don't have too much trouble telling them where they should go and how fast they should get there. Where were you when I was, stuck in TDCJ? But changing your playground, where are you going to spend all your leisure time? Obviously, if you're an alcoholic, you've got no business going to a bar or a nightclub or a pool hall or even a casino. I mean, let's face it, casinos, they keep the booze flowing, so you'll keep playing that handle. If you're a drug addict, you don't need to be near a dope house. You don't need to be at a nightclub either. And if you're a gambler, well, forget the casino. And you probably don't want to frequent any place that sells lottery tickets if you don't have to. So that's an important thing. Changing your playmates. You definitely cannot afford to be around people who are still involved in that lifestyle, whether they're drinking or drugging or even involved in behavioral addictions. You don't need to have them in your life because what you've got to do is flee temptation. And if Larry, Moe, or Curly is still smoking dope or shooting dope or drinking, you would be crazy to hang out with them. It's just too easy to fall back. And you've got to change your playthings. You got to get rid of the six-packs. You got to get rid of all your bottles of booze. Got to get rid of your pill bottles, your syringes, all your drug paraphernalia. There's no getting around it. You don't want that stuff around you, tempting you every time you see them. So, we're changing our playground, our playmates, and our playthings. Well, especially to change our playthings, we have to come up with alternate things to do with our free time. It's like when you're changing a bad habit, you got to replace it with something else. So, what can you do? You know, if your lifestyle always involved the nightlife and hanging out at the clubs, what am I going to do now? Well, how about a hobby? A lot of people in prison were in the craft shop and they learned woodworking or leatherworking or metalworking. If you were any good at it, that's a good hobby to pick up again now that you're free. You might even make some extra money on the side. If you like to read, and a lot of people in prison rediscover books because it's a lot nicer reading books in your bunk than it is fighting over the TV. Well, if you like to read, hey, join the library. If you like movies like I do, get a subscription to Netflix. You can stay at home and have at your fingertips, about 1,000 different shows and movies. Of course, you have to use some discretion about what you watch, but your recreational activities. Maybe you've never had any before. It's always been all about your addiction. Well, now you've got to come up with something else. Maybe you used to fish as a kid. Maybe you like to bowl, play tennis, play golf. It doesn't matter. Just find something to do with your free time. Probably the best thing you could do is get active at church. And we'll talk more about that in a little bit. Now, the second suggestion or key is recognizing that people who were addicted to something typically are in the habit of acting impulsively, acting without thinking. And that's because, we talked about yesterday that addictive behavior typically affects the frontal cortex of the brain, which has to do with rational thinking and impulse control. So it's time now, we've got to learn to control our impulses. So you need to learn to ask yourself a question before you act or before you make a major decision. Will this meet my needs over time? For example, if you come up to me and say something bad about me and my mama, I might be very tempted to punch you in the nose, which, if it doesn't cause me to break my hand, it might make me feel good for a few seconds. That is until you punch me back, and we're in a fight, and we both break out in handcuffs, and I may have just ruined my life. That did not meet my needs over time. It was a stupid thing to do. If you're a Christian, maybe you'd rather ask yourself, what would Jesus do? Or what would Jesus have me do? But the point is the same. Think before you do anything. We definitely want to get out of the habit of ever acting while we're under the influence of strong emotion, and definitely we don't want to be acting if we're inebriated, because any of us who have made a habit of that know how much trouble that's caused us. The third suggestion, learn to be content. Develop an attitude of gratitude. Now that's easier said than done in our society, isn't it? I mean, how many people have bought into that whole keeping up with the Jones mentality? That can get you in a lot of trouble. I mean, for example, I drive around town in my little Hyundai. It's a compact car. It's rather modest, but it's the most reliable car I've ever had in my life. It's also got the best gas mileage of any car I've ever had. And I'm perfectly content with it. Or at least I may be until my next door neighbor shows up with a $60,000 pickup truck. And then all of a sudden I'm thinking, oh, my little car is so small. It's so inadequate. What does this say about me? Well, there's a big mistake, is thinking that what you drive is a statement about yourself. Oh, we've got to break that trap. How many have ever driven through a modest neighborhood or even a shabby neighborhood and found that in their driveways they've got Mercedes, Volvos, BMWs, Suburbans, you name it? That's because these people are thinking, nobody will ever see where I live, but they'll see what I'm driving. And when they see what I'm driving, they'll think that I'm making it. That is so wrong. I remember I was at some financial seminar or I read this somewhere. They said, the best idea that you should have about cars, and I'm a car person, I love cars, but think of a car as an expensive appliance. It's transportation. It's not a reflection on your worth as a person. If you have to, think of it as a toaster on wheels. You don't need to spend $60,000 just to drive around Lubbock. If you want to do that, that's your prerogative, and I would not interfere. But if you're a former addict, you probably can't afford that. So learn to be content. Because if you're not content, it's so easy to get trapped in negativity. Thinking about all you've lost, what you used to have and don't have, and may never get again. And of course, that's just pushing you towards relapse. Thinking, man, my life is awful. I need something to take the edge off. Well, there we go. We're just about to fall off that cliff. So I suggest people, in trying to get an attitude of gratitude, before your head hits the pillow at night, try to do some rational thinking and try to come up with 5 things you're grateful for that happened today. It's not that hard. And the more you do it, the easier it gets. And so you go to bed happy. And as we talked about yesterday, happiness is probably the number one factor that'll keep you sober. Number 4, find a job. Fred, find a job. Stop being a lowlife. Fred and I went to school together, and he's retired, so he won't get too upset if I mess with him a little bit. But anyone who's been an addict may have a pretty spotty job history. You got to fix that. And of course, if you're coming out of prison, your parole officer definitely wants you to find a job. But you've got to keep in mind that you're starting over. You're starting from ground zero. Now, there are exceptions. There are some people that get out of prison and their old boss takes them right back. Or they work for dad. And that's wonderful. But most people don't have that luxury. So you may have to take a job that beforehand you would have thought was beneath you. It's beneath your level of education or your qualifications. But that's okay. We'll learn a little humility. The important thing is to find a job. Nobody says you have to stay there forever. But one thing I always advise people, unless your job is requiring you to do something immoral or even worse, illegal, don't ever quit a job until you've got another one. And that's just psychology. Because if I'm a potential employer and you come to see me and I find out pretty quick you haven't worked in 2 or 3 months. All sorts of red flags are going up. I'm thinking, I bet this is an addict. Or, what's wrong with this person? Why can't they keep a job? Are they unreliable? Are they the kind of person where you never know if they're going to show up or not? Are they the kind of person who can't get along with other people? Am I going to have to worry about him causing problems with his coworkers, or even worse, with my customers? So, this looks like a bad gamble. Whereas if you show up and you've got a job and you've even got a letter of recommendation, say you've been working at McDonald's for 6 months, and when you started, you thought, man, I haven't worked at a place like this since I was in high school. This is so humiliating. Well, maybe it is, but if I'm the potential employer and I see this, one, I don't have any questions as to why you're talking to me. I wouldn't want to work at McDonald's either, And you got this nice letter of recommendation saying that you're dependable, you're a good worker, you get along with people. Bingo, you're hired. You don't look like a risk at all. So, why have a job besides pleasing your parole officer? Well, there's lots of reasons. It sure helps to have money. It also helps with being content because I got some money. It helps with your self-esteem. I'm employed. And it keeps you busy. You've heard that phrase, an idle mind is the devil's workshop. Well, that's certainly true with an addict. If I got nothing to think, nothing to do, chances are my thinking is going to go south, and I'm going to start nursing all my resentments, all the people I'm mad at, all the people that did me wrong, and all the things I'd like to do to them. That's not healthy. That could also get me back in relapse. But you also have to use wisdom, though, when you're looking for a job. For example, up in Plainview, there is a major distribution center that will hire ex-cons. But people in that area know that at that distribution center, there's a lot of drugs being bought and sold. So that's not necessarily the place you want to go to if you are a recovering addict. So, you got to keep things in mind like that. Fifth, be reconciled to your family if possible and if prudent. Now, it may not be possible. I did time with an awful lot of people who had burned an awful lot of bridges. Because when you're an addict, it's oftentimes your family that you do the worst. They're the ones you lied to the most, manipulated the most, stole from the most. And there are a lot of people who are not getting visits, money, or letters from anybody they're related to. And they know it's on them. So when you get out, if that has been your track record, you need to approach your family with great prudence. You probably need to spend a little time free so that you can establish a track record. Show that you aren't the same old game player that you used to be. And when you do have your first contact with your family, whatever you do, don't ask them for money. Because that's going to convey the message, oh, here we go again, playing me for the same old fool. Not this time, Buster. Hit the door. But now, sometimes it's not prudent to return to your family. Yesterday, we spoke quite a bit about unhealthy homes. And if your home is unhealthy, if there are lots of family members who are involved in drug or alcohol use, you probably need to keep a safe distance. For example, I counseled for a number of months with a fellow who was out of prison, and his family was a big part of his problem. They were all living the gangster lifestyle. And he finally worked up the courage to tell them, look, guys, I love you. I'd love to have you visit my home. But when you come, you cannot bring the drugs, the alcohol, or any of your paraphernalia. You've got to leave that home because I can't be around it, and I am not going back to prison. Fortunately, in that case, they respected his wishes, and everything worked out fine. 6, one of the things that we need, we talked about it before, about changing your playmates. You know, we have to surround ourselves with positive people. People who will be a source of encouragement, who will be a good influence on us. You know, it could be people in your support group. It could be people you're getting to know at church. Maybe you're making new friends at work. It doesn't matter really how you're making the friends, unless you're making them at the dope house. Now that's verboten. Don't do that. But recognize that we all need people. And recovering addicts, we don't need to be by ourselves. Isolation is always a recipe for disaster. It's like that idle mind. We tend to get negative when we're by ourselves. And we need to avoid toxic people, even if they don't use. You know what I mean by a toxic person? Yeah, some people are nodding their heads. This is an unhealthy person. This is a person with issues of their own. They got their own baggage and they've never gotten help for it. And so when you're around them, you inevitably get hurt. They hurt your feelings. They make you feel bad about yourself. Don't do that to yourself. You know, life's too short. I've even known people who their twin was the most toxic person in their life. Usually you think twins are just closer than close, but that's not always the case. And if you have to cut ties even with a twin sibling, do it. I don't know where I picked this up from, but I never forgot it. And that is, if someone wants to judge you by your past, they don't belong in your present. Get rid of those people. Get them out of your life. Number 7. We talked about this yesterday, but it was true yesterday and it's still true today. Get counseling. Because as we talked about, at least 2/3 of addicts, whether or not they've ever been incarcerated, came from abusive homes. And so you do have your own issues, your own baggage. And addicts, if they really want to make a break from their addiction, it's really important for them to find out for themselves what's been driving the addiction. It's something, because they've been self-medicating maybe for years. What are they medicating? They need to discover and heal those underlying causes. And that's not something that we usually can do by ourselves. I used to tell people for years that I had a Leave It to Beaver kind of background. In my mind, it was idyllic. It wasn't until I was in my 60s, that I discovered that my family was really messed up. I mean, I knew nothing was perfect, but hey, it was the only family I knew, and I didn't really have the perspective to understand how messed up they were and what a number they had done on me over the years. So I got into counseling in my 60s, and it was an eye-opener. I found out there was a reason why I was so bizarre. It wasn't all my fault. I had a lot of help. So if you have baggage from your past, you need to deal with it. You know, again, life is too short. Don't continue to suffer. And if you can't afford it, call 211 and find out if there are community resources for mental health in your area. Step number 8 is also a rerun from yesterday. but again, it's still true, and that is get real medication. Stop self-medicating. You need to find out if you've got some real psychological problems. And if you do, it's not the end of the world. There are an awful lot of Americans who deal with anxiety and depression. And it's very common for ex-addicts to be dealing with anxiety and depression. And let me tell you, when you first get sober, chances are you're going to be depressed. Because everything that gave you pleasure in the past has now been excised from your life. You got nothing to produce any kind of artificial euphoria. Now everything is deadly dull, black and white. And it's depressing. And you can't see any end in sight. There is hope, but you can't see it yet. So you would be well advised to get on some kind of antidepressant. If fear has been a major part of your life, they got lots of anti-anxiety medicine. Or you may have something more exotic. You know, you may have something like bipolar, schizophrenia. They got medicine for that too. And why not avail yourself of that? Well, the reason that a lot of people don't avail themselves of that is just the fact that there is a stigma attached to mental illness. There shouldn't be, but there is. And just realize that suggesting that someone needs counseling, well, that's a touchy subject. You might never see them again. You got to use some real wisdom in bringing that up. I found that out the hard way. Telling someone, you know, you really need to get into counseling, oftentimes does not go over well. But that is an important thing. As we talked about yesterday, if you really want to have a reasonable chance at making it as a sober person, we got to get our brain chemistry evened out. We've been messing with it the wrong ways for years. Let's do it the right way now. Number 9. Write for yourself a list of reasons why you want to get sober. That sounds pretty simple, but it can be pretty profound. You want to write a list of all the things you can think of, all the reasons why it's in your best interest to stay sober, and you need to post it in a prominent place, maybe on your bathroom mirror, maybe on your refrigerator door, maybe both places. And you probably need to look at it often, because the temptation to relapse may be happening often. And that list, depending on how long you use, could get pretty long. You could include things like all the stupid things you've said or done that you can remember while you were under the influence. But even more important, think about all that your addiction has cost you over the years. Oh boy, we might have to spend a few hours on that one. You know, all the relationships we destroyed, the jobs we lost, the marriages we destroyed, the cars we wrecked, the money we lost, maybe the times we've been arrested, maybe the times we've gone to prison. The list could be pretty lengthy, and that list in itself should be sobering. When you see what this has cost me personally, even I can now see I would be a fool to ever return. It's one of the things that I tell the people in my parole group. A lot of them have done a lot of time, and a lot of them are my age or close to it. And we constantly remind ourselves, look, if we ever use again, we know we're going back, because they do random urinalysis tests for those on parole. And we know also, if we go back, in all likelihood, we will die in prison. Now, it doesn't get much worse than that, except maybe dying in Hobby Lobby, but that's a topic for another day. Don't want to die in prison. And let me tell you, in most prisons, the medical care is not great. And especially as you get older, you're not going to get the care you need. You don't want to go to prison as an older person. So, write that list. Number 10, don't get in debt. Now, if you have been a functioning addict, that may not be a problem. Maybe you have been able, by functioning addict, I mean you've been able to hold down a job while you've been using or acting out. And so maybe you're not in debt, although because of your addiction, maybe you are. And if you are in debt, my first advice is, before you spend another dime, make sure you pay off your drug dealer, because they'll come looking for it. And usually they won't come alone, and they'll be packing. So that's one person you want to pay. Your mortgage officer, they might write you a dirty letter, but they're not going to put a bullet in your head. Capiche? I mean, that's just the way it is. But if you're coming out of prison, this is a real temptation to get in debt. People come out of prison, especially if they've been there for a long time, they want to make up for lost time. And the fact of the matter is, you can't do that. It'll never happen. And you will do a lot of trouble, do a lot of damage to your finances if you try. All these rent-to-own places, stay away from them. You miss one payment and you lose everything you've paid up to that point, along with the sofa and the TV set that you were renting. But the fact of the matter is, you've got to stop the impulsive behavior, including impulsive buying, and you've got to learn to be content, as we already said, because along with that, you need to learn to wait until you can actually afford what it is you want. You know what Dave Ramsey says? Maybe you don't, but if you don't, I'll tell you. He tells you to cut up your credit cards and buy everything with cash, with only two exceptions: your home and medical expenses. Very few people can put cash down and buy a house. We normally need a mortgage, and if you need medical care, you need it whether you can pay cash for it or not, so get it. But other than that, don't get into debt. One of the things that you've probably heard is that financial problems have broken up more marriages than just about any other single problem. Well, guess what? Financial problems produce an awful lot of stress, and that can also lead to relapse. You want to feel hopeless. You find out that I've now got $10,000 worth of credit card debt, and I just lost my job. Boy, do I need something to take the edge off. So don't do that. Don't do that to yourself. Learn to be content with what you've got. Focus on what you do have and what you can do. Don't focus on what you don't have and what you can't do. Another very practical advice is don't rush into romantic relationships. Well, now, if you're already married, obviously, I would urge you to stay married, unless your spouse is using. In that case, I'm not saying you have to run out and get a divorce, but you sure don't want to live with your spouse if they're still using, because that is a sure ticket to relapse. But you need to give yourself plenty of time to adjust to sobriety and to be able to focus on staying sober. And if you've gotten out of prison, you need a lot of time just to adjust to the free world. I remember when I got out, there were a lot of things that I didn't know how to do. The world had changed a lot in 17 years. I'd never used a cell phone, didn't know how to use the internet, lots of stuff like that. In fact, when I first got out, I had never even seen one of those self-serve soda fountain things, like at Pizza Hut or someplace. I was looking at that thing, trying to figure out, okay, what am I supposed to do with this? That was a humbling experience. But I learned. But let's face it, relationships can cause an awful lot of stress. Because relationships involve people. And people can be difficult. Especially as you become more and more intimate with them and they become more and more part of your life. An awful lot of people have relapsed because of relationship problems. If you're a former addict, you sure don't want to date someone who is using. And you don't want to date someone who hasn't been sober any longer than you have. You want to date someone who's got a real track record, who won't be a source of temptation. I don't know if any of you ever saw the movie 28 Days. It was a Sandra Bullock movie. And she played an alcoholic who was sent to rehab. And somewhere towards the end of her stay there, her counselor, the guy that kind of ran the place, gave her some interesting advice. He said, when you get out of here, my advice to you is, first get a plant. And if you can keep that plant alive for a year, then think about getting a pet. And if you can keep that pet alive and healthy for a year, then and only then think about dating. You got 2 years of responsible living under your belt. Now maybe we can think about dating. But that doesn't mean rush into marriage. But whatever you do, don't move in with somebody. Don't shack up, because that's against the will of God. That's not a good way to go. Number 12, get right with God. If you haven't obeyed the gospel, well, it's high time you did. Get right with God through faith in Christ. There is no better advice that you can give anyone than doing that. And that may involve us more than any of the other suggestions that I'm making. Because as Christians, we have a responsibility to share what we know. And let's face it, as members of the Lord's church, we are the only ones who know what a person must do to be saved. They never heard it from Billy Graham. They're not going to hear it from Kenneth Copeland. So remember, we want to save souls. We don't want to just keep them sober and free. We want them to find the freedom that can only be found in Christ. And so we should invite them to go to the assembly with us. Now, we got to use some prudence there. If you're a member of a church like Sunset, which, as far as Churches of Christ goes, this is kind of a mega church. We can't compete with Rick Warren, but the fact of the matter is, having a very large congregation can be very intimidating to a former addict. They're nervous around church people anyway. They're afraid everybody here is going to be judging me the whole time I'm here. They're afraid of rejection. Maybe they've had lots of bad experiences with church in the past. Christians can be kind of rotten sometimes. It's pretty easy for us to get pharisaical and start thinking that salvation and church is for good people. What are you doing here? So if you are a member of a large congregation, it might be prudent to start by inviting them to your small group. That's not all that intimidating. 6 or so families, that's okay. And maybe they can get to know some Christians and come to the conclusion, hey, these Christians aren't so bad after all. They're not a bunch of holier-than-thou stick-in-the-muds. Hey, maybe this can work. However, if you know that the congregation that you attend is one that is not particularly welcoming to outsiders, then you could really do your buddy a great service by helping them find a congregation where they would be welcomed, because they need a new support family. They need a new playground. They need new playmates, and they need new playthings. Well, the Bible is about the best plaything you could possibly introduce them to. Number 13, if they do obey the gospel and become a Christian, by all means encourage them to pray to God Almighty for deliverance from their addiction. Because I know from firsthand experience, God will honor a prayer like that. He will take away the cravings. He's delivered me from several addictions over the years, and if He'll do it for me, He'll do it for anybody. We want people to be delivered, not just to have to cope without their addiction. We want them totally delivered from it so that it's no longer even a factor. And that's the way it is with me. I don't care how bad things get. The thought of drinking never even occurs to me. Ever. The only time I think about alcohol is when I'm talking about it to people like you or at my parole group. God really did me a great favor. Number 14, try to convince them to quit smoking. That's the hardest addiction of all to break. If you don't believe me, just go to any AA or NA meeting and you'll see lots of people smoking like chimneys, either in the building or outside. They may have been sober for 20 years, but they're still smoking. It was a number of years ago that the American Medical Association came out with a report that said nicotine is the single most addictive substance known to man. And the tobacco companies paid attention. And you know what they did? They just shot more nicotine in all their products to make it even more addictive. Let's face it. These days, tobacco is obscenely expensive. That's the only way I can put it. When I was a smoker, I would smoke about a carton a week, and I could get a carton of cigarettes for $10. Nowadays, $10 will get you a pack of cigarettes, or maybe a pack and a half, I don't know. But your average recovering addict cannot afford to waste that much money on something that does absolutely no good and has the potential for doing nothing but harm. I've got a guy in my parole group who's a diabetic, and I can't get him to quit smoking. He's on disability, but he's still smoking. And he's doing terrible damage to himself. And let's face it, a lot of people don't have health insurance. And if you don't have health insurance, you sure don't need to be actively engaged in behavior that's going to cause you health problems down the road. Number 15, don't give up if you relapse. If you do relapse, you know Satan's going to be knocking on your door saying, well, I guess it's true. Once a drunk, always a drunk. Or, Jeff, you are such a loser. You know that, don't you? I mean, why did you even try to quit? It's not going to happen. It's in your blood. You are an alcoholic. Well, you can't listen to that kind of thing because it's not true. Lots of people have broken addictions, and anyone can do it. If you have relapsed, one of the things you need to do is talk to God. Admit what happened, ask for forgiveness, and ask for His help in picking yourself up, dusting yourself off, and get back to walking in the light. Now, if you're on parole, whatever you do, don't lie to your parole officer. That's dangerous. They don't like that one little bit. If you've messed up, you better fess up. Most will forgive, at least the first time. I'll never forget my first parole officer. I only had her for a month, but she made a real impression on me. She told me, if you're having trouble, let me know, and I'll do whatever I can to help you. Tell me the truth, and I'll be your best friend. Tell me a lie or try to run a game on me, and I'll be your worst enemy. I've never forgotten that, and I think it's still good advice to people on parole, especially when they're doing these random urinalysis tests. You can't run a game on your parole officer. Not for long. You're going to get caught. And if they find out that you've been playing them for a fool, chances are they are going to retaliate. Even if you're not on parole, every addict, even one who has just relapsed, you need your support group now more than ever. Don't isolate yourself. Don't think to yourself, oh, I don't dare show my face, at the group again. Oh, please, like you're the first person who's ever relapsed? That's ridiculous. No, those are the people you need to talk to. They're not going to rub your nose in it. They're going to, hopefully, if it's a healthy group, they are going to try to buck you up, shore you up, and help you to stay sober. Don't abandon the church. Don't think, oh dear, I've sinned, now I can't go back to Sunset. If that were the case, they'd never let me through the doors. And that's, I think, is true for everybody that attends here. It's not the end of the world. It's unfortunate. It's got to be dealt with, but deal with it. Don't just give up. Number 16, a recovering addict needs to be encouraged to stay healthy and to stay active, but at the same time, don't overdo it. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, I've told you, a lot of times people want to try to make up for lost time, or they want to keep up with the Joneses. One of the worst things you could ever do is try to get a second or third job to earn more money. Now, you may be thinking, wait a second, that's very responsible. Well, I will admit, if you really are in danger of having no place to live unless you get a second job, well then by all means, you got to do what you got to do. But if you don't have to, if it's not that dire, then don't do it. Because having a first, second, and third job is just adding to your stress level. And stress is the number one cause of relapse. So it's not a good idea. Not if you don't absolutely have to have the money. And in addition to that, don't get so busy that you can't keep your promises or keep up with your obligations. You're trying to make a fresh start. You're trying to make a good impression on your family. Don't promise your kids a bunch of stuff and then let them down because you took a second or third job and you can't do it. You'll ruin your relationship with them. You'll undo all the good you've done up to that point. So, that leaves us with our final key, our final suggestion, and it's stress. It really behooves anyone who's a recovering addict, whether or not you are a functioning addict, whether or not you've ever been in prison, a recovering addict really needs to do everything he or she can possibly do to keep stress at a minimum. Because stress is the number one cause of relapse. Now, you can never get rid of stress. Life is tough. Jesus said, in this world you will have trouble. And boy, did he know what he was talking about. Even after 38 years, there's a lot of times I'm stressed out. But I certainly don't go out of my way to try to add to it. No, I try to fix things so the stress will go down. So, there's my list of 17 just practical ideas that you could share with someone who is trying to get out of addiction. It's not rocket science. I don't claim it is. You don't have to be a genius to have come up with this stuff, but it's all stuff that a recovering addict needs to know. You can really do them a huge favor by sharing these things with them. And I think I've run my head long enough. My gums are getting tired of flapping, so if anyone has a question, I'd be happy to try to answer it. Yes, sir.
One of your points said to not look at it as once an addict, always an addict.
Mm-hmm.
But I guess myself being a former addict of a different type, I guess I use that as a badge of honor in a way that I always remind myself I'm always recovering, so I'm always an addict. I'm only, one relapse away from becoming it again. So is it healthy for us to look at ourselves as addicts?
I don't think so.
Okay.
I don't think so. That's fear-based. Okay. That whole idea that I'm only one step away from relapse. No, God can deliver you from your addiction. You don't have to live your life afraid that relapse, could happen any time. Now, that's true for the first few months that you're in recovery, but I think it's far more healthy to think of myself as I am a child of God who has been delivered from his addiction.
And I do agree with that, yes.
Now, it is true that once you have shown a predisposition to addiction, to some behavior or some chemical, yes, there's no question about it, you should never play with it again because you've still got the same predisposition. Don't fall for Satan's lie that, I've been sober for 6 months now, I got a job, I got a car, I'm an upstanding citizen, surely I can drink responsibly now. No, that's just not in the cards for an alcoholic. So in that case, yes, you always have the potential to get re-addicted. But I wouldn't tell myself for the rest of my life I'm an addict or I'm an alcoholic. No, I'm not. I don't use alcohol. I haven't for 38 years. I'm a child of God who's been blessed by God with deliverance from addiction.
Well, the reason I ask the question is just because when trying to help other people or trying to, hopefully get to minister the gospel to them, I refer to myself as a recovering addict. Always going to be in recovery because every day you're always going to continue to fight to make sure that you don't go backwards.
Mm-hmm.
And it seems to work, when you're having those conversations with people because they get comfortable with you because they see themselves as, oh, hey, this guy goes to church and yet he's admitting to me that he is a former addict.
Mm-hmm.
So I guess that's the only reason I ask. Well,
I have no problem with that. Yeah, if you're dealing with someone, especially someone who has a history of addiction, be forthright, be transparent and admit, I've struggled myself. I know what you're going through. And it would probably shock the socks off of them. A church person who's been an addict, whoa, Nelly. Who would have thought? But it's true. And of course, there are a lot of people in the church who are still struggling with addiction, but they won't come out of the closet. They're so afraid.
But it is amazing to be able to reach some of those people when they see that we're just as vulnerable and susceptible to sin as they are.
Yes.
And
Yes.
then we're so willing to admit it to them.
Yes, you can do so much for the cause of Christ when you're transparent. When you aren't a stereotype, you aren't Pharisaical, you aren't holier than thou. You don't stick your nose up, that I'm real. I got the same struggles you do. And I've fallen more times than I can count. Yeah, that makes the gospel very attractive. That, whoa, you mean Jesus came to save knuckleheads like me? You bet he did. Anybody else? Well, listen, I think I've used up my time. I appreciate your being here. I hope something I said resonated with you and that it'll be of some help to you. You don't have to be in full-time ministry to minister to people. And I think you can minister to people struggling with addiction with some of these suggestions. Just remember, you can't help someone who doesn't want to be helped. So don't get discouraged and burn out because somebody didn't want what you had. Well, all righty. You are dismissed.
Thank you.